In the far, far too many years that I've been collecting watches, I've kind of made fun of big watches, and I've criticized people who wear them, criticized them humorously, and I'm not going to stop now, even though I'm one of those people. Check out my big pair. The Omega Seamaster Ploprof 1200 meters, aka the Ploprof, the no-date titanium version, and the Panerai Luminor Marina PAM111, aka the PAM111. When I bought each of these watches, they said, "You can't buy that, it's too weird, it's too big, you won't wear it, you'll sell it in months." And that was years ago. I've had each of these watches for more than 5 years, and I actually wear them, and I really still like both of them a lot. And I kind of don't understand why, so maybe we can figure that out together. I've tried to make it clear how much I like smaller watches. I think a 36mm watch on my 7-inch wrist looks good, like this Rolex Explorer that I bought 4 years ago, and I even think a 25.5mm watch works on my wrist, like this Cartier Tank that I've had for a while now. I think classically sized watches look thoughtful somehow, considered and tasteful, and yet these behemoths, I don't know, man, I just work here. Both of these watches are so big and so weird looking for good reasons, good historical reasons. Neither actually needs to look like this for practical purposes anymore, but you know what? Neither do humans. In the case of the watches though, they have a lot of vestigial elements that I find charming, with humans not as much. Ploprof is a portmanteau. That's when you kind of take two words and combine them, like spork or brunch or f***tard. Here, Ploprof is a combination of the words plongeur and professionnel. Diver, professional, professional diver, and of course, professional divers were the original market for this watch. That should be obvious, because if you can't imagine someone wearing this today, imagine someone 50 years ago wearing this to the grocery store. I'm just kidding. I don't think grocery stores even existed 50 years ago. No way of knowing. The reason for the ridiculous case design was so this watch could withstand extreme pressures when saturation diving. Divers living and working in deep sea diving bells breathe a mixture of oxygen and helium, and the goal of this bananas watch case was to keep the helium from getting in. So the case basically had to keep a sea level atmospheric pressure inside the watch, while the pressure outside the watch was super high, up to 120 bar of pressure, or 1200 meters of ocean depth. But before this watch was released, Rolex figured out a better way to solve this problem. The helium escape valve. This valve let helium get into the watch and let it out in a controlled way while still allowing the watch to be water resistant. Funnily enough, this modern Ploprof actually has a helium escape valve, so there's no reason this case needs to be so huge and bizarre. No reason except that it's f***ing awesome. But the absurdity does not stop there. On the left side of the case is a gnarly crown guard that actually goes over the crown. It's a crown lock, really. It seems mostly unnecessary for saturation diving, but I guess it can protect from unscrewing the crown in a diving valve accidentally. And then the orange button on the right side of the case. This is a bezel lock. Pressing the button unlocks the rotating bezel and lets you rotate it in either direction. Why? Why lock it? You're not even really timing dives when you're saturation diving. Thankfully though, this watch does have some modern tech. It's titanium, which means it's actually pretty wearable and not too heavy on my 7-inch wrist. Really, this weighs about the same as a steel Rolex Submariner. People don't believe me, but it's true. Now, if you see a Ploprof with a date window, that's steel, and in my opinion, that is unwearably heavy. I've tried it. But this one, this titanium one on the wrist, is great. This is also the only era of Ploprof to have a display back. It might make the case a little thicker, but when we're already talking about 18mm in girth, what's a little more or less? 18mm thick, 55mm wide, and only 48mm long across the wrist. Much wider and thicker than the Panerai PAM111, but also much shorter. And none of you believe me, but I'll just keep saying this. It's wearable, it's comfortable. You should see people's faces light up when I let them try this on. Now, I interpret those faces as saying, wow, this watch is really cool, but maybe their faces are really saying, oh, bless his heart, poor thing. While the PAM111 is smaller in some dimensions, it's larger in others. It's bigger in all the right places. It's longer. The Panerai PAM111 is 15 millimeters thick, 44 millimeters wide, and 53 millimeters long. In several ways, it wears larger than the Ploprof. The length for sure, but also the big dial. By comparison, the Omega has a much smaller dial, which gives the two watches very different looks. It's also got a more vintage appearance, and that's because the Luminor Marina has a story that begins about 15 years before the Ploprof. The first Panerai watches to use this weird crown guard lock thing came out in 1955 and were made for the Italian Navy and then the Egyptian Navy. And I'm skipping a lot of historical details, but for decades, Panerai watches were only available to militaries. Now, this specific case design didn't debut until 1993, when Panerai made its public debut. And this is still my favorite Panerai case. This watch has such great presence without being enormous. And I know you're thinking, it's not enormous, but no. In the world of Panerai watches, this is the Goldilocks size for me. Panerai has regular production watches up to 47 millimeters in diameter, and at least one limited edition watch, the Egiziano, that's 60 damn millimeters in diameter. So even though I have some huge watches, there are some watches and some people that I can still make fun of, and that's all I really need in life. I love the sandwich dial of this watch. That's when the main dial has cutouts for numerals or markers, and then there's a dial underneath the main dial, and between those two dials is a layer of luminescent material. Now, not all Panerai watches have a sandwich dial. In fact, most don't. Most don't currently or even historically, but I really like the depth that this adds, so much so that it took me weeks to find the right PAM11 when I bought this back in about 2018. Sandwich dial. I also really like that this has the older non-in-house movement. I guess you can call that an outhouse movement, but that doesn't sound right. Panerai calls this movement their OP11 movement, but it's really a decorated ETA Unitas 6497. There's really nothing special technically about this movement in any way, and that's kind of a selling point. It's simple, it's common, it's cheap to fix and service, plus I think it looks great. And this Panerai PAM111, it's really one of my most worn watches. These things, these big, awkward, thick watches. Before I owned the Panerai, I really never thought I'd own a large watch. I didn't think I'd own one, let alone two, let alone wear them all the time. What happened to me? I used to have taste. I used to be reasonable. I used to have self-respect. But the truth is, I came to a realization a few years ago, maybe when I decided to buy the Panerai. It's probably something that most of you have always known about watches. They're supposed to be fun. It's not much more complex than that. It shouldn't be. I talk a big game and I talk stuff about watches I don't like, but the truth is, the boring truth is, that if someone is enjoying the watch that they're wearing, then it's a great watch. It doesn't have to look good to me or tell a story that I appreciate. If someone's wearing it and they like it, that's all that matters. But I can't say that all the time because then all of my videos would be like, here's a watch. If you like it, it's good for you. The end. And that's not very fun. But here are two watches, and they're big and freakish and dumb, and I like them, and they're good for me. The end.